less than 40 kilometers wide at its narrowest navigable point. The Strait of Hormuz is the passage for nearly 20% of the world's daily oil supply. That is around 17 to 20 million barrels every day. There's also a massive share of global LNG flows. For energy-hungry economies across Asia and beyond, this is the jugular vein. Today, that has become crystal clear. By early March 2026, Brent crude surged past $100 and spiked toward $120 plus. This triggered inflationary pressure from China to India. It rattled currencies, forced central banks into crisis mode. Shipping traffic collapsed. The entire global economy came to the brink, all because of this one shipping choke point and Iran's fight for survival. Today, we'll understand how this one trade choke point can kill the global economy. This is the story of the Strait of Hormuz. How did Hormuz become the world's strongest off switch? It began on February 28, 2026. The chain reaction had been building for decades. Direct strikes on Iran shattered what remained of containment. Within hours, the world's most sensitive artery, the Strait of Hormuz, became a weapon. For Iran, the human cost arrived first. Israeli and American airstrikes wreaked havoc across the country, leveling infrastructure and igniting urban fires visible from satellite imagery. Among the dead were civilians in dense population centers, including 168 schoolgirls. Reports also emerged of the killing of Iran's supreme Ayatollah, Syed Ali Khamenei, the successor of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who led the 1979 revolution. What happened next was something that the country had braced itself against for decades: a decapitation war. For Iran, this was a battle for survival. Since the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, officials repeatedly warned that if cornered, they would close Hormuz, the narrow passage through which nearly 20% of the world's oil flows. But a decade ago, things were finally looking hopeful. In 2015, Iran agreed to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, accepting strict limits on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief, a deal backed by the United States and European powers to stabilize the region and keep global energy flows predictable.
Historic understanding with Iran.
The Ayatollah, the Supreme Ayatollah, formally embraced the agreement.
امروز یک روز تاریخی است.
But when Washington withdrew from the agreement in 2018 and reimposed sweeping sanctions, the economic pressure on Iran intensified sharply, cutting oil revenues and isolating it from global markets. Over the following years, tensions escalated. Gaza was leveled, Lebanon was pummeled, Syria's Assad government collapsed, Yemen's Houthis were weakened. Iran was the next domino. But what about Hormuz? Well, during the brief but intense 2025 12-day war, the strait remained open. Iran did not carry out its threat.
Naturally, Israeli and American strategists felt this time that things wouldn't be much different. But they had severely miscalculated the situation. Iran sees this latest war as a fight for survival. The strait is its biggest weapon, and it has shown that it will use it. The invisible blockade, how geography and Iran's strategy align perfectly. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran's southern coast and the Musandam Peninsula of Oman, linking the Persian Gulf to the open waters of the Arabian Sea. But zoom in, and you can see that the geography is not as simple as it sounds on paper. The navigable shipping lanes are squeezed into corridors barely 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a similarly narrow buffer zone. Every tanker leaving the oil terminals of Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia, or the massive loading facilities at Ruwais and Jebel Ali Port in the United Arab Emirates, must pass through this funnel. To the north, Iran overlooks the lanes from a jagged coastline lined with islands like Keshem and Larak, which are natural platforms for surveillance, missiles, and fast attack craft. Geography here benefits Iran. What makes this choke point extraordinary is the scale compressed into space. On an average pre-crisis day, roughly 17 to 20 million barrels of oil, close to 1/5 of global consumption, flow through this corridor, along with a significant share of the world's liquefied natural gas, particularly from Qatar. That means economies thousands of miles away, such as factories in East Asia, refineries in Europe, and power grids across South Asia, are all tied to a passage narrower than many metropolitan highways. When disruption begins, it cascades outward, touching every node connected to energy pricing, transportation, and industrial output. But the true fragility of Hormuz is not just physical, it is psychological. You see, Iran does not actually have to block the strait in any physical sense. They don't even have to mine it. They don't even need a navy to manage the flow of shipping from this choke point. All they had to do was exploit the behavior of markets and the risk calculations of private actors. The first layer is denial without declaration. IRGC operators broadcast warnings over maritime radio frequencies, labeling certain vessels as potential threats or requiring clearance that may or may not be granted.
All vessels that have a connection with our enemies will be targeted if they try to pass the Strait of Hormuz out.
The second layer is asymmetric pressure, calibrated with precision. Drones appear over tanker decks, sometimes merely observing, sometimes signaling targeting capability. Anti-ship missile batteries along Iran's coast remain mostly silent, but their known range, often exceeding 200 kilometers, casts a wide shadow over the shipping lanes. Fast attack boats conduct aggressive maneuvers, closing distance before peeling away. These actions are intermittent, unpredictable, and therefore far more effective. A single confirmed strike is enough to reset global risk models. Insurers react instantly, raising premiums to levels that make passage economically irrational. The third layer introduces uncertainty in its purest form. Mines that may or may not be there. Unlike the dense minefields of 20th century naval warfare, Iran's deployments in 2026 are partial, dispersed, and in some cases, poorly documented even by its own forces. By April, reports suggest Iranian units themselves struggle to track exact mine locations. Or they may simply say so, to suggest that there are mines out there, even if there aren't. Mines do not need to sink dozens of ships to be effective. The possibility of a single detonation in a narrow channel is enough to halt traffic. Ships are not physically barred from entering the strait, but they stop coming anyway. Charter rates surge, insurance contracts are withdrawn, and shipping companies reroute vessels thousands of nautical miles around Africa rather than risk a single transit through Hormuz. The choke point remains technically open, yet functionally unusable. The ports that depend on this corridor begin to feel the strain almost immediately. Saudi Arabia's eastern export terminals reduce throughput. The UAE's refining and re-export hubs see volumes collapse. Kuwait and Iraq, heavily reliant on Gulf shipping routes, face bottlenecks that ripple into production decisions. Even Iran's own exports are affected, but the strategy accepts this cost, trading revenue for leverage. Oil prices surge, but more importantly, the reliability of supply is shattered. This is the real power of the invisible blockade. Iran does not need to sink fleets or seal waterways. It only needs to make the act of passage unpredictable.
Global economic dominoes. Worse than COVID-19. The moment traffic through the Strait of Hormuz collapsed in early March 2026, the crisis stopped being about ships and started becoming about systems. Roughly at 20% to 25% of the world's seaborne oil and a critical share of liquefied natural gas had been moving through this narrow corridor every single day. When that flow faltered, disaster unfolded quickly. Within days, governments, traders, and manufacturers realized that this was a structural shock, one that began to rival, and in some sectors, exceed the supply chain paralysis seen during COVID-19. The first wave hit with energy pricing. Brent crude, which had been trading in relatively stable ranges of $75 to $85 per barrel earlier in 2026, surged past $100 and then spiked toward $120 to $126 in volatile bursts. For import-heavy economies like China and India, the math turned unforgiving almost overnight. China had been importing roughly 10 to 11 million barrels per day, with nearly half tied directly or indirectly to Gulf supply routes. Consuming about 5 million barrels daily, India had depended on Hormuz for close to 60 to 65% of its crude imports. As prices climbed, fuel subsidies came under pressure, currencies weakened against the dollar, and central banks were forced into tightening cycles that risked slowing already fragile growth. In Japan and South Korea, both importing over 90% of their energy needs, emergency stockpiles were drawn down at accelerated rates. But this only bought them time. Then came the second wave, industrial compression. Liquefied natural gas shipments, especially from Qatar, one of the world's top LNG exporters, began to stall, reroute, or arrive with delays stretching into weeks. Power grids in gas-dependent regions felt the strain first.
triggering peak pricing and emergency procurement. But the deeper impact unfolded in energy-intensive industries. Fertilizer production, heavily reliant on natural gas, began to contract sharply. Global ammonia output dipped. Urea prices surged by double digits within weeks, and export restrictions began appearing in key markets. Because fertilizer underpins global agriculture, the shock moved forward into food systems. Farmers across Southeast Asia, South Asia, and parts of Europe faced rising input costs just as planting cycles demanded stability. The true extent of this shock is yet to be felt, but it will be huge when it comes. By mid-March, the third wave crashed in. Shipping companies, unwilling to risk transit through Hormuz, began rerouting vessels entirely. Tankers and cargo ships diverted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding between 4,000 and 6,000 nautical miles to routes that once passed quickly through the Gulf and into the Suez Canal. What had been a 20 to 22-day voyage stretched into 30 to 35 days or more. Fuel consumption per voyage surged. Crew rotations became strained. Global container rates and tanker charter costs climbed sharply, echoing patterns seen during the Red Sea crisis around Bab el-Mandeb. Only now, the scale was several times larger. The consequences began stacking in unexpected places. Aviation fuel prices rose in tandem with crude, forcing airlines to cut marginal routes and raise fares across international corridors. Petrochemicals, derived from oil and gas, became more expensive, feeding directly into manufacturing costs for plastics, electronics, textiles, and packaging. Even industries far removed from energy markets began to feel the squeeze. Food distribution costs rose as transportation became more expensive. Supermarkets across Europe and Asia quietly adjusted prices upward. Inflation, which had been stabilizing after post-pandemic turbulence, surged again, with energy and food leading the climb. What made this shock more destabilizing than COVID-era disruptions was its simultaneity. During the pandemic, demand had collapsed even as supply chains fractured, creating a complex but partially self-balancing system. In 2026, demand remained intact, if anything, still recovering, while supply was abruptly constrained. Factories still needed fuel, cities still required electricity, and populations still demanded food. But the inputs feeding those systems had become unreliable. Governments attempted to respond. Strategic petroleum reserves were tapped in the United States, Europe, and parts of Asia, releasing tens of millions of barrels into the market to stabilize prices. But these reserves were finite, designed for short-term disruptions measured in weeks, not prolonged instability in a corridor handling 1/5 of global supply. Diplomatic channels opened with alternative producers in Africa and the Americas. Yet spare capacity outside the Gulf remained limited, often less than 2 to 3 million barrels per day globally. Even when additional supplies were secured, transporting them became a challenge, as shipping capacity was already stretched thin by rerouting. By early April, the pattern had become unmistakable. What began as a maritime disruption had evolved into a full-spectrum economic event. Energy markets remained volatile. Industrial output was under pressure, and global logistics were operating under a strain not seen in years. This latest global crisis was driven by geography, of all things. But then the two parties sat down to negotiate in Islamabad. Things again looked hopeful. A ceasefire was agreed to, but a final agreement eluded both parties after an intense 21-hour talk.
We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement.
Then, the President of the United States played his best card. He said that he would install a blockade on top of Iran's blockade, which allowed some ships to pass if they paid a toll. This brings us to our next critical question. Can an American blockade work? In a word, no. When Donald Trump announced that the United States would impose its own blockade on top of Iran's, the idea sounded aggressive and decisive.
The naval blockade with the greatest navy in the world, from the greatest military the world has ever seen.
Any ship that paid Iran a toll to pass through the Strait of Hormuz would be intercepted, even in international waters. But almost immediately, reality started poking holes in that strategy. Despite U.S. claims of enforcement, multiple tankers, including sanctioned vessels, were still able to transit the strait. Some were not even subtle about it. Shipping data showed vessels moving through corridors effectively controlled by Iran, particularly routes hugging Iranian territorial waters near Larak Island, where Tehran had established a toll-based safe passage system. Then came the more revealing contradiction. The U.S. military insisted that no ships made it past the blockade in its first 24 hours. Yet almost simultaneously, independent tracking and reporting confirmed that several vessels, including Chinese-linked tankers, either passed through or attempted to pass through the strait. You see, legally and practically, the U.S. was trying to do something unprecedented. Interdicting ships that paid Iran a toll, even if they weren't carrying Iranian oil, weren't heading to Iranian ports, and weren't violating international law. The U.S. Navy can stop, board, or redirect vessels under certain conditions, but it cannot universally police every commercial ship in international waters without escalating into direct confrontation, not just with Iran, but with other major powers. Countries like China, heavily dependent on Gulf energy, had little incentive to comply with a U.S.-imposed restriction that effectively weaponized trade routes. Some Chinese-linked vessels had already demonstrated a willingness to test the blockade. This wasn't defiance for the sake of it, it was economics. Even when the U.S. did successfully intercept or turn back ships, it highlighted another limitation. Selective enforcement is not the same as control. Stopping 5 ships, or even a dozen, does not equal sealing a corridor that normally handles nearly 100 vessels per day. In fact, data showed that since February 28th, total traffic had already collapsed by over 90%, with only a few hundred ships transiting in weeks instead of thousands. And then there's the geographic trap. The U.S. cannot fully position itself inside the most dangerous segments of Hormuz without exposing its own vessels to the same threats it is trying to neutralize: missiles, drones, and fast attack craft operating from Iranian territory just miles away. So, enforcement happens further out, in the Gulf of Oman and beyond. But that creates a loophole. Ships that pass through Iran's controlled corridor first are already through the choke point before the U.S. can effectively act. This is why the counter-blockade was always structurally flawed. It assumes that global shipping can be forced into compliance.
Well, it can't, unless the USA wants to risk hitting a Chinese-linked ship. But what about trying to open the strait by force? Force alone will never reopen the strait. It looks decisive on paper. Carrier groups move in, jets launch, missiles lock targets, and the world expects the problem to be solved. But the reality around the Strait of Hormuz proves something far more uncomfortable. Force can control space, but it cannot restore trust. And without trust, the strait remains effectively closed, even when it is technically open. But still, in the first week of April, the United Arab Emirates formally pushed for an emergency multinational maritime protection force at the United Nations Security Council, warning that the Strait of Hormuz was no longer a regional passage, but a global economic lifeline under threat. The proposal outlined joint naval patrols, coordinated mine-clearing operations, and even a shared insurance backstop to stabilize commercial shipping. By April 7th, the initiative had stalled. China and Russia vetoed key enforcement provisions. They argued that a Western-led maritime force risked escalating the conflict and undermining sovereignty in contested waters. At the same time, expectations that NATO would fully align behind the United States began to fade. As early as mid-March, European members had signaled a far more limited role. Statements from defense ministries in Germany and France emphasized de-escalation and maritime stability rather than direct enforcement operations inside Hormuz. Naval deployments were redirected toward surveillance missions in the Arabian Sea and intelligence-sharing frameworks rather than escort operations in the strait itself. There was no unified coalition surge comparable to past Gulf operations like the 1991 tanker escorts or post-2003 patrol expansions. To understand why force alone cannot reopen Hormuz, let's look back to the disruptions around Bab el-Mandeb during the Red Sea crisis. In late 2024 and early 2025, despite sustained U.S. and allied naval patrols, shipping traffic through the Red Sea had dropped by more than 50% at its peak. The attackers were not even a conventional navy, yet intermittent drone and missile strikes created persistent uncertainty. Insurance premiums surged, vessels rerouted around Africa, and even after attack frequency declined in early 2025, traffic took months to partially recover. Similarly, after a month of relentless bombardment and countless civilian lives lost all across Iran, the idea of reopening the strait became increasingly misleading for Israel and the United States. The waterway had never been physically sealed in the traditional sense. Oil prices were reacting to signals of uncertainty. A reported drone sighting near shipping lanes could move futures markets within hours. a brief naval exchange could add several dollars per barrel in a single trading session. Meanwhile, efforts to stabilize the situation moved into quieter diplomatic channels. On the 8th of April, Pakistan had brokered a limited ceasefire framework. The ceasefire, while fragile, held as both sides cautiously stepped back from immediate escalation. In the days that followed, delegations from the involved parties even met face-to-face in Islamabad to discuss conditions for a more permanent cessation of hostilities. But the talks ultimately stalled. Despite the lack of a breakthrough, both sides agreed to continue dialogue, with a second round of talks expected to return to Islamabad under Pakistani mediation. It was in this tense pause that Donald Trump reiterated political support for Pakistan's role in facilitating the talks, specifically acknowledging the leadership of Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir as central to keeping communication channels open during the ceasefire window.
I want to thank the country of Pakistan and its great Prime Minister and its great Field Marshal. He's our great Field Marshal. Two fantastic people for helping.
Yet even as diplomatic messaging intensifies and expectations of a second round grow, the underlying reality at sea remains unchanged.